Human resources, human capital, people, and culture. This single vocation has many names. HR professionals are responsible for what is arguably the most critical success factor within any organization. It's talent. HR Studio Podcast brings you bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond. Listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. For over 35 years, AJO has built its reputation on experienced listening, exceptional quality, and caring partnerships, delivering services in 30 states and 20 countries. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com and be sure to check out our top-ranked HR blog and sign up to receive email alerts while you're there.
Well, welcome everyone to HR Studio Podcast. I'm Fred Bunsa, and I'm your host for today's episode. We have with us today Darrin Murriner, who hails from a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Darrin, we invited him here. He has over a decade of experience working at some of America's largest corporations. He's managed large teams, complex teams at companies like Arthur Andersen, Fifth Third Bank, and Munich Re. He's been in those environments. He's been both an employee as well as an outside consultant in areas of operations, finance, and even risk management. And what caught our attention was that in 2015, Darrin co-founded a company called Cloverleaf Me. It's a company that brings together a technology platform and using it to build high-performing teams. And also in 2015, he published a book called Corporate Bravery, which we would recommend. So when he's not working, he's married. He's got three children living in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, the thriving metropolis of Fort Thomas. So we'd like to welcome Darrin to the podcast. Hi, Darrin. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me on today.
Thanks for being here. I want to talk about two things. One is what caused you to write Corporate Bravery, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and then how that relates to the kind of work that you're doing today. So what was it that brought about this, the book you wrote, Corporate Bravery?
Yeah, well, it really is based on a lot of my personal experiences in those organizations that you mentioned, but also, at Arthur Andersen, I had an opportunity to be in a lot of organizations. I got to see a lot of different cultures, and just kind of the variety of environments that are created. And it's largely the people. It's the managers, it's the senior leaders, it's the individuals that are working in those cultures on a daily basis. And so I've always been fascinated by that, just the differences as we went from, client to client and looking at those different cultures. And started asking myself a lot of questions about what creates this. And then one of my last corporate experiences, just experienced a lot of organizational fear for many reasons, but I think largely driven by regulatory reasons. And it really just started me kind of down the path of kind of organizing those thoughts and ideas around what creates a fear-based culture. And more specifically, what drives fear-based decision-making.
So fill us in then. What did you learn? What did you discover as you thought about that and as you reflected on your experiences? What are some of the things that characterize a culture of fear?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that's tightly linked to fear is control. So if you have a really forceful kind of control type organization, command and control organization, that can obviously be a major driver. The higher the number of levels you have in a hierarchy, an organizational hierarchy, the more likely you are to have a more fear-based culture. The regulatory environment is a good example. So when you look at organizations like large integrated financial institutions, or maybe pharmaceutical or healthcare, those are industries that just are extremely highly regulated and continue to have more layers of regulation placed on them. And a lot of that comes back to the ambiguity or the unknown of those regulations. In many situations, they have multiple regulators from different, federal, state, local levels.
Right.
And a lot of times those regulations can be in conflict. So how do they, that kind of uncertainty or that ambiguity can also create a lot of fear-based decision making.
And without regard to particular industries, because you can imagine that industries that are heavily regulated would have a greater propensity towards fear because you don't want to mess up, you don't want to misserve your customers. But regardless of industry type, what are some of the other things that can lead to a culture of fear in a company?
Yeah, well, there's obviously a lot of management practices that can contribute to that. So one of the things that we cover in depth in one of our chapters is really about individuality and how do you promote and support individuality and give people the opportunity to kind of bring their whole self to work. Because the more they feel like they have to hide who they are, or maybe, one of the things that's very common and prevalent today is kind of side gigs or, the gig economy.
Right.
People who might be in your organization and maybe they're driving for Uber, on the weekend, or maybe they're creating their own business, doing freelance work on the side. And I think largely that's kind of hidden. Unless you have friends in your work group, you typically don't talk about those things because that can be seen as, hey, I'm not committed, and the reality is it's probably they're just not getting an opportunity to flex those muscles in the organizations they're at. And it's an indicator that those are things that keep them engaged. They like doing that type of work. And that's the reason why they're having to go outside of your organization and find those opportunities to do that outside of the four organizational walls that they're in. And, management's response to that can obviously create a pretty strong fear-based culture.
So, do you recognize companies that do a good job managing that? Is they might notice those things and ask the person how they can bring some of those same skills or that same energy to the organization and do it for them and not on the outside.
Yeah, that's right. I've read several examples. No one that I've worked with directly comes to mind, but one particular example that I think of is Airbnb. And, they recently kind of eliminated, and when eliminated is maybe a harsh word, but they recast kind of their HR department away from being traditional HR and to employee experience. And the focus there, the focus there is very similar to customer experience. So the same way you would be relentless about creating an experience for your customer that creates an emotional attachment and makes them feel good about interacting with your brand on a daily basis, is kind of the same thing they're trying to create with this employee experience mindset. So it's shifting HR to be more of employee centric as opposed to organizational centric. So that's an example of an organization I think is doing that well. And but that's becoming much more, I think, prevalent, especially with unemployment rates in the low single digits. And if you look at tech talent, especially, you just can't afford to take an alternative approach and retain key technical talent.
Yeah, the marketplace certainly seems to have shifted in favor of the employee now in terms of marketability and hiring and other opportunities and the war for talent, whereas just maybe 5 years ago even people would have been much more willing to toe the line or just live with an uncomfortable or a less desirable scenario because they didn't have as many other options.
Sure. Yep.
So it's in some ways the good economy then has spurred kind of innovation in organizations to do things differently to compete.
Purely out of necessity. Absolutely.
Yeah. Darrin, can you describe or make a distinction between this culture of fear you're talking about and then lack of trust? We, in your work with teams, our work with teams, that oftentimes that's a red flag. They're telling us, I'm not sure there's a deep level of trust here within the team or within the organization. is fear and trust completely interchangeable terms, or are there distinctions that's worth our audience to understand?
Yeah, the way I think about it is, and you're exactly right, trust is a huge part of that kind of fear culture or lack of trust. And I consider it two sides of the same coin. And typically when you look at mistrust, it comes from a handful of key factors. One is just knowledge. I might make assumptions about why you're doing something and underlying motivation. And a big part of that trust comes back to how we communicate and how we know each other. So one of the things that we talk about in the book is kind of moving from an ownership to a stewardship approach. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of organizations, and especially the larger the organization gets, there's this kind of mindset or focus on I've got to control what's mine, and whether that's people. And you'll even hear people say that, right? This is my team. This is, my organization. And we need to move away from that mindset, from an ownership model to more of a stewardship model, because that ownership implies that you want to kind of maintain or control this little piece of the world that I might have some authority over. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times that mistrust is caused by misinterpreting those motivations or those assumptions, or just a lack of knowledge. So those are two of the key kind of factors that contribute to mistrust. And then obviously where mistrust exists is where fear can kind of creep in.
Okay, so trust might be a leading indicator because where trust is lacking, fear seems to follow in quickly behind.
That's right.
What are some examples of things that you've seen along the way that you highlight in the book of how fear can really harm an organizational culture?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we highlight is just kind of competition as an example. Somebody rolls out a new competitive product. One of the things that read recently was about Amazon, and every time they enter a new market, the corresponding stock drop relative to the number of times that they're mentioned in earnings calls. And I've seen organizations, when Amazon has moved into a new category, and suddenly that will drive the conversation. It'll drive decisions. People really just kind of get freaked out over the idea that we have a bigger, more agile competitor in the market. And that actually starts to drive decision making, instead of saying, no, this is what we're good at. This is our competitive positioning in the market. And let's truly understand who we are as an organization and what we can compete on. And let's make sure that we focus more on those aspects, so that regardless of whether it's Amazon or another competitor, let them be who they are, and let's focus on who we are. And oftentimes, and we talk about this at length in the book, having a really clear understanding of who you are, not just as an individual in the context of the team, but also as an individual or an individual inside the organization, but knowing who the organization is, what are your strengths and how can you leverage those things, will allow you to avoid kind of falling into the trap of letting some of those fear factors, whether it's regulatory, competitive, management, or other environmental factors that can contribute to fear. Having a really strong organizational sense of self, or organizational sense of culture, can allow you to avoid falling into those pitfalls.
Okay. And does the work you do at Cloverleaf, I think it contributes to some of that, right? Knowing the strengths and then leveraging them in a more powerful way. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So our platform is really built around, when I mentioned earlier kind of what contributes to this mistrust, it's, poor communication, and it's a lack of understanding. So one of the things that we do with the Cloverleaf platform is give people an opportunity to really understand not just themselves, and there is oftentimes a lack of awareness of the individual, but also understanding their peer group or their managers and how they work and how they communicate and where they can best be leveraged in the context of the team objectives. And once you have that understanding and you can tailor the communication style towards the people that you're working with on a daily basis, it eliminates a lot of those opportunities for fear to creep in. Now, there are still things that happen, right? I mean, organizationally, things change, or, again, competition, regulation, some of those other kind of environmental factors. But having a really strong sense of self and a really strong sense of what your role is in the context of that team can go a long way towards creating fertile ground for trust in the context of the team.
So how does the platform pull that together? Because you can give people a self-assessment. A manager can share their own assessment with their team. You can do a RACI chart about roles and responsibilities. What's different about the way you've bringing that mix together?
Yeah, and we still use some of those instruments. So, I mean, assessments is a key part of it. A lot of people have taken things like DISC or Myers-Briggs, and we support or offer opportunities to provide those as inputs into the process. But really, there's two key factors that I think allow us to do this more successfully than maybe some of the other approaches. And the first is visualizations that lead to insights for managers so that they have a really clear understanding of who their team is, where those strengths lie, and then more importantly, a really clear way of setting goals and objectives for the team. What skills and competencies do I need to be successful as a team? What are the relational dynamics that exist in this team? So the visualizations and the insights is one piece of it. And the second piece is kind of embedded integrations with communication tools. So we have a Slack app, we have integration with email and calendaring that puts that information in a context and at the point where you're communicating with the people on your team to help you be more effective. It drives actual positive behavior change over time. And, the more we can increase the effectiveness of the communication and the awareness or understanding of the people on your team, the more opportunity we have to build and establish trust in the context of the team. And I think ultimately create a strong organizational culture.
So can you give me an example of how this integration you're talking about around communication, give me an example of what that would look like and what the potential payoff is?
Sure. Yeah. So some of the things that we do is, and I'll give you a really simple one because a lot of people may not be using Slack and may not really understand how that works. But we just send a simple email once or twice a week, depending on how frequent teams want to receive that. And it's customized information, not only about how you work, but how your people or how the people on your team work as well. And so we give you really specific guidelines. So, my co-founder, as an example, might receive a message that says something along the lines of, exercising her authority. And oftentimes that's hard for her because she might feel like she's exercising too much control or she's pushing down work that she knows that they may not like. And the information that she receives from one day to the next can kind of help contribute towards being more effective with those things that she struggles with. And then it's tailored to the people on her team. So it actually kind of helps identify how she can assign those responsibilities to Tim versus Matt, who operate and work very differently. So it's capturing preferences, styles, skills, and talents, and then there's a visual way to identify those things in the program, and it allows the leader of the team to then distribute work and engage with others accordingly. That's right, and we're layering in machine learning. So AI is the hot buzzword of the day. And we're layering in machine learning to get even more predictive with that. So we can look at power structures or power dynamics inside the team or inside the organization and start to actually serve up even more tailored messages and communication and tips to help drive effectiveness around communication and relationships based on how those relational dynamics are at play.
Okay. And do you have recommendations for our audience of rising HR leaders about when is this best? I mean, it seems like this would be best suited for long-term, intact teams. But what about a 90-day project team or something like that? Is it worth the trouble, so to speak, the effort to set this up for a team that's going to disband in a fairly short period of time?
Yeah, oftentimes it's even more effective with those teams because they don't have a baseline understanding of who their teammates are. So if you think about a traditional software development project or, in the agile world and in the Scrum environment, you're putting people together that typically operate and work very differently from each other. You might be putting a software engineer with a project manager with a business owner. And how the strengths that all three of those people bring to the table and kind of their traditional work style are going to be dramatically different. And oftentimes that leads to conflict or misunderstanding. And, if you go back to the traditional kind of forming, storming, norming model of team building, one of the things that talks about is that storming process has the opportunity to really sap a lot of productivity. So the faster you can move through storming and towards performing, the more effective your 90-day or your 160-day team will operate.
I see. And so the clients that you work with would put this platform in place, and then whenever a team is created, they would just pull down the data for the members who are in there and start running with it.
That's right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good. The idea, if you could think about, for our audience, again, our audience is leaders, particularly in the HR space. Have you learned things about teams beyond the tapping the individual capabilities and having a more customized view? Is there anything about the way a team comes together or a way a team does it work that would be applicable, that would be helpful to our audience as they work with teams?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we find is that the traditional team forming model is, do you have the skill set and are you available? That's kind of like the baseline question that most people ask when they form a team. And the problem with that is you're not capturing kind of this cognitive diversity element. And what we find is really high performing teams focus on kind of a diversity of cognition. So the way we think, the way we process information. And that's really where the power is. There's a really great Harvard Business Review article that came out in March of 2017 about that very thing. And when we look at the research, it's often not, the traditional things that we think about from diversity, like age and gender and those kind of components. And it's way more about putting people with different cognitive styles together. And that's really where we get the performance increases. And that's part of why we built Cloverleaf, is to give managers a different perspective. If we only get past skill and availability, we're really missing an opportunity to take teams from just okay to exceptional. And, all the statistics say that most people have a very terrible team experience. If you go all the way back to high school or college and you did, class projects in a team environment, which, is all the rage in education circles. The problem is we never really taught people how to team effectively, and we never really focused on anything more than just kind of surface level factors in putting those teams together.
So not just availability and skills, but something more about the way they think, the way they decision make, the way they see the opportunities. Those factors come into play. It sounds like even more powerfully than some of the more traditional factors of how a team works effectively together.
Absolutely. And then I think the other thing too that we often see is, dedicated team membership. And that's not always possible, but, the more that you can dedicate somebody to a team. And then team size is also really important as well. Getting above about 7 to 10 individuals on a team, things really start to break down. And your ability to kind of build a high performing team is somewhat stymied.
Darrin, say a little more about dedicated team. I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Yeah, so not being shared across 3 or 4 different projects.
Okay.
And oftentimes, especially when we have large strategic projects or initiatives, people still have their day job and are expected to kind of contribute at a high level to those project teams. And what we find is dedicating resources. And that's part of the reason why Agile and Scrum has gained such a big foothold in a lot of organizations, is because they really focus on that dedication. Team size, dedication are key hallmarks of that methodology.
So when our listeners are putting together a team and they're inviting people on and they say, I really don't have much availability, and they say, well, we need you anyway. Just beware, right? That's
right. That's right. And by the way, don't let anything fall with your day job.
Yes. Keep that full steam ahead. Darrin, is there anything that you've created along the way that we might be able to share with our podcast listeners, our subscribers, that would be helpful to them in this whole area?
Yeah, so we continue to do research on teaming and high performance teams, and we actually released a white paper recently. And it's really all about culture and teams and the relationship between those two things. We also covered a little bit around some of these assessment tools and how you can use those more effectively in building high-performing teams. And I think we're going to provide a link, and I think potentially in the show notes you can make that available to the list.
We will do that. So, Darrin, as we wrap up today, first of all, thank you for joining us. But when you think about our audience of rising HR leaders and leaders across all functions, is there anything you would really encourage them to think about doing differently when it comes to them working on or recruiting teams?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is just making sure that you're looking beneath the surface. So it's not just about skill and past experience, or it's not just about have they been in that role previously, but it's also how does the dynamic change for the existing team? There's a context that exists there that they're going to be working inside of. One of the things that we talk often about is this idea that you can just go get a really high-performing star and bring them in. And the reason why they were a high-performing star is oftentimes because the context was right. They had a really supportive manager. Yeah. They had a work environment that really contributed to helping them be the best of who they are. And really understanding, is the context that you're bringing that person into going to be the right context? Is it aligned with their career objectives? Is it the type of work that that's going to get them excited to get out of bed for in the morning?
That's awesome. Well, Darrin, thank you for being our guest today. Again, the name of Darrin's book is Corporate Bravery, and Cloverleaf.me is his organization. We would recommend you check them out. And for those of you who are not yet subscribers, if you go to hrstudiopodcast.com, if you subscribe to the episode, we'll let you know when we release our new episodes, and we'll also be able to give you access to the show notes, including the white paper that Darrin spoke about today. Thank you for making that available to our listeners, Darrin.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. To discover additional information from this week's episode and to catch up on all episodes, visit hrstudiopodcast.com. Subscribe to the HR Studio Podcast list while there and receive alerts and future updates.